I turned 76 this spring, though if you ask my children, they would say I have been old for decades already. They see my age in every slow step I take, in the way I need to pause before standing up from the armchair, in the glasses that hang perpetually from my neck on a worn cord. To me, age feels different. Inside, I often sense the same man who once held my wife's hand while we danced in the church basement, or who taught my son how to ride a bicycle in the empty parking lot of the school on a Sunday afternoon. But when I catch my reflection in the hallway mirror, with my sunken cheeks and thinning white hair, the reality of time hits me like a stone. I live alone in the house that my wife, Margaret, and I bought together 50 years ago, when we were full of plans and laughter and arguments about paint colors. After she passed away 6 years ago, the walls became unbearably quiet. At first I tried to keep them alive by playing the radio every morning, letting Sinatra or old jazz records echo through the rooms, but eventually the sound only deepened the silence that followed when the music stopped. I have since grown accustomed to the stillness, though sometimes, especially at night, it feels less like peace and more like abandonment. My children, 2 daughters and a son, have their own lives, their own jobs and spouses and mortgages, all of which I am constantly reminded are more pressing than their father's solitude. They call occasionally, sometimes out of duty, sometimes because they want to reassure themselves that I am still breathing and not in need of rescue. I have learned not to expect much. When they do visit, the conversations quickly slip into surface-level chatter. The weather, the latest TV show, my medication schedule, and always a quick glance around the house to make sure I am managing. They speak of me as though I were a fragile relic from another century, an object to be cared for, but not really listened to. I used to resist this characterization, correcting them, asserting that I am still capable, still clear-minded, still a man with preferences and opinions. Over time, I discovered that my protests only made them sigh with condescension, so I stopped. There is a particular loneliness in being alive but unheard, present yet invisible. As my birthday approached this year, I dared to hope for something different. The children had promised to organize a special celebration, their words carrying a tone of novelty, as though they were finally going to show me that I mattered, that I was more than the aging figure in their periphery. My expectations were modest, perhaps a dinner with all of them together, a cake, maybe even a toast that acknowledged my years, not with mockery, but with respect. I had begun to prepare for the day in small ways, polishing the shoes that had sat unused since Margaret's funeral, pressing my one good jacket, and even going to the barber for the first time in months. The barber, an old friend, asked me if there was a lady I wanted to impress. I laughed and said, "No, just my family." He raised his brows with a look that suggested he doubted they deserved the effort, but he trimmed my hair neatly anyway. The morning of my birthday arrived gray and damp, the kind of spring morning when the clouds seem undecided about whether to weep or hold back. I awoke early, as I always do, my body clock no longer tethered to any schedule but its own. I made myself oatmeal, drank my coffee slowly, and tried to imagine what the evening would be like. Would they remember the things I once enjoyed, the foods Margaret used to cook for special occasions, or would it be something catered, efficient, impersonal? I told myself not to care, that the mere presence of my children and perhaps my grandchildren would be enough. I practiced a smile in the mirror because I knew there would be photographs, and I did not want to look as dour as I sometimes feel. As the day unfolded, I busied myself with small tasks to keep the anticipation from becoming anxiety. I dusted Margaret's old porcelain figurines, the ones the children always mocked as creepy, though she had adored them. I watered the plants in the window, rearranged the framed photographs on the mantel, Margaret in her garden hat, the children at different ages, the family dog that died long ago. Each picture stirred memories both sweet and heavy, and I found myself speaking aloud to the empty room, telling Margaret about the upcoming party, about how, maybe, just maybe, our children had rediscovered some affection for their father. I wanted to believe she was listening, that she might somehow attend with me in spirit. When the time finally came to leave, I put on the jacket, still slightly loose around my shoulders, and fastened the silver cufflinks Margaret had given me for our 30th anniversary. They had been her father's, and she always said they made me look dignified. The walk from my car to my daughter's house felt longer than it was, partly because of the stiffness in my knees, partly because of the weight of expectation pressing on me. As I rang the bell and heard the muffled rush of voices inside, I reminded myself to be grateful, to accept whatever form of celebration awaited. I was a man who had outlived his wife, outlived many of his friends, and who had been spared, at least for now, the indignity of the nursing home. Gratitude, I told myself, was the only fitting response. But behind the door, as I would soon discover, gratitude would be tested. My birthday, the day that should have reminded my children of where they came from, of the man who raised them, was about to become a stage for something else, entirely. What I imagined as love and respect was already being prepared as mockery, a spectacle dressed up as humor. I did not yet know it, but the moment the door opened and I stepped into the laughter and chatter of my family, I was stepping into a performance I had not agreed to play in, a cruel comedy in which the punchline would be my own mortality. When the door opened that evening, I was greeted by a burst of voices and the smell of food that did not remind me of Margaret's cooking, but rather of something ordered from a catering service, the kind of uniform dishes prepared to be convenient, rather than meaningful. My daughter, the eldest, leaned forward to kiss my cheek with the perfunctory air of someone greeting a distant relative at a formal gathering, rather than her own father. She said, "Happy birthday, Dad," with a brightness that rang hollow, the way one might wish happy holidays to a cashier. Behind her, my son clapped me on the back as if we were old drinking buddies rather than father and child, and my younger daughter offered a smile that seemed rehearsed. I tried to ignore the faint ache that came with noticing the absence of warmth, and told myself that perhaps I was being overly sensitive. I convinced myself that the effort, however superficial, was still effort, and that I should accept it graciously. As I entered the living room, I saw balloons with the number 76 printed in bold, their metallic surfaces catching the light. A banner stretched across the wall read, "Still Alive," in large red letters, a choice that made me pause. I laughed lightly, more out of politeness than amusement, and commented that it was creative, though inside I wondered why my birthday had to be framed as survival rather than celebration. The room was filled with family friends, neighbors, and even some of my grandchildren's companions, young people who had no particular connection to me but who were present for the spectacle of a party. I shook hands, nodded, and endured a series of jokes about my age, my gray hair, and my supposed forgetfulness. It is astonishing how quickly a man can be transformed into a caricature, once the number of his years exceeds those of the majority in the room. I was offered a seat in the center of the room, a position that felt less like a place of honor and more like a stage, and for a while I tried to enjoy myself. There was a cake, gaudy with too many candles, which I struggled to blow out in one breath, eliciting exaggerated cheers and laughter as though my effort were the punchline to a shared joke. I smiled weakly, telling myself that perhaps this was simply their way of lightening the atmosphere, though deep down I felt the sting of being reduced to a performance. My grandchildren snapped photos, whispering to one another and laughing behind their phones. I wanted to ask them to stop, to look at me as a person rather than an object to be captured and mocked. But I swallowed the words. Then came the moment that would change everything. My son announced loudly that they had prepared a very special surprise for me, something that would fit the occasion perfectly. The guests clapped and cheered, anticipation filling the room. 2 of my grandchildren disappeared into the hallway and returned carrying a long, polished wooden box. At first I thought it was some kind of oversized gag gift, perhaps a novelty chest, but as they set it upright and then lowered it to the floor, recognition struck me like a cold hand. It was a coffin, a real coffin, glossy and lined with satin, unmistakably crafted for death. The room erupted with laughter, and my children, grinning, announced that this was my preview, a chance to get comfortable in the bed I would one day not leave. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as the guests egged me on to climb inside. They were chanting, laughing, raising their glasses. My son said, "Oh, come on, Dad, it's just a joke. Lighten up." My eldest daughter, in a voice both teasing and commanding, added, "We want to take some photos for the scrapbook." I wanted to refuse to tell them how grotesque this was, how cruel and disrespectful, but the eyes of everyone were on me, and I felt trapped between my dignity and the crushing fear of spoiling what they insisted was humor. Slowly, with the stiffness of humiliation pressing against my bones, I lowered myself into the coffin. The laughter grew louder, cameras flashed, and my grandchildren held their phones high, filming me from every angle as though I were a circus act. I lay there staring at the ceiling, the satin beneath me cool against my back, my heart thudding. Not from fear of death, but from the agony of being mocked by those who should have cherished me most. The lid was lowered partially, not fully closed, and I heard someone joke that it was good practice. My son pretended to deliver a eulogy, his words dripping with irony. Here lies Dad, who never could fix the leaky faucet but always managed to. Complain about it. The room roared with laughter. I forced a smile that felt like a wound stretching across my face, desperate not to give them the satisfaction of seeing how deeply they had cut me. Inside, I was screaming. I remembered Margaret's voice telling me long ago that birthdays should always honor life, that every year was a gift. If she had been there, she would have stopped them. She would have defended me, but in her absence, I was alone, lying in a coffin while my children celebrated my mortality as entertainment. When they finally let me rise, I did so carefully, not wanting to reveal how my knees trembled, not from age this time, but from shame. They clapped as though I had performed a trick, some brave act of comedy, and immediately the images of me climbing out of the coffin were shared around the room on glowing screens. I sat back down, my smile frozen, and endured the remainder of the evening as best I could, nodding at conversations I barely heard, tasting food that felt like sawdust in my mouth. Every now and then someone would slap my shoulder and repeat the refrain, "It was just a joke, you know." I nodded each time because what else could I do? If I protested, I would be labeled bitter, humorless, senile even. To them the coffin was laughter. To me, it was betrayal. Later, when I returned home, the silence of my house was almost unbearable, heavier than usual, pressing down on me like the lid of that coffin. I sat at the kitchen table with the lights off, staring at my hands, which trembled slightly, not from age, but from humiliation. I turned on the computer, seeking distraction, but was met instead with the spreading wildfire of my disgrace. The video of me in the coffin was already online, shared by my grandchildren, captioned with jokes about me getting used to my future room. Strangers were commenting, laughing, adding their own cruel remarks. I scrolled endlessly, my chest tightening as I realized that my humiliation had now become entertainment, not only for my family, but for the world. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the pounding of my heart. The coffin had not just been a joke. It had been a declaration, a symbol that to them I was already halfway gone, an object of ridicule rather than respect. My birthday, the day that should have affirmed my worth, had instead stripped me of it. And yet as the night deepened and the shadows grew, something inside me began to harden. If they wanted to treat me as if I were already dead, then perhaps it was time to show them that the man they dismissed still had life, and perhaps even power, left in him. That night, after the party, sleep refused to come. I lay in bed with the covers drawn to my chest, staring into the darkness, the images of the coffin replaying in relentless detail as if my mind were punishing me for my weakness. Every laugh, every camera flash, every cruel remark echoed inside me like a chorus. I told myself to forget, to close my eyes and think of Margaret, to imagine her soft hand against my cheek as she had done in the quiet hours of our marriage when words were unnecessary. But each time I tried, the vision of my son standing above me, delivering a parody of a eulogy, shoved its way forward. I turned on the lamp and sat upright, staring at the faded wallpaper, trying to understand how my own children had come to see me not as a man, but as a joke. When dawn finally broke, I was not rested but hollow, and as I shuffled to the kitchen to make coffee, I felt as though some part of me had shifted. Something fragile that had always believed in the core decency of family had cracked. With my mug of bitter coffee in hand, I turned on the computer almost instinctively, as though checking email or news would anchor me to ordinary life. But what I found instead pushed me deeper into despair. The video of me in the coffin was no longer confined to the circle of my grandchildren's friends. It had spread, shared across social networks, accumulating comments from strangers who did not know me but felt entitled to mock me. They called me Grandpa Corpse, Practice Run, Walking Fossil. Some of the comments came from accounts with photos of children no older than my great-grandchildren might have been, their words laced with cruelty that chilled me. I scrolled for hours, unable to stop, each new comment a lash across my dignity. I knew I should close the screen, but I was trapped, like a moth staring into a flame that would eventually consume it. When the phone rang, I nearly jumped. It was my eldest daughter, her voice breezy, as though nothing unusual had happened. She asked if I'd enjoyed the party, if I'd seen the photos online. I hesitated, unsure whether to reveal my true feelings, but something in her tone, light, condescending, devoid of any awareness of the pain she had inflicted, stopped me. I murmured something about being tired and hung up quickly. Afterward, I sat for a long time staring at the phone, realizing that she had not called out of concern, but to reinforce the narrative that this humiliation had been acceptable, that it was normal to mock me, that I was expected to laugh along with them or else be cast as humorless and senile. Later that day, I decided to take a walk, hoping the air would clear my thoughts. The park near my house, where Margaret and I once took evening strolls, was almost empty. I sat on a bench beneath a tree that was just beginning to bud, watching a young couple walk past with their child. The little girl clutched her father's hand tightly, laughing up at him with complete trust, and I felt tears prick my eyes. Once my children had looked at me with that same adoration, and I had carried them on my shoulders, patched their scraped knees, stayed awake through their fevers. How easily those memories had been replaced by mockery. I sat there until the sun began to sink, unwilling to return to the empty house, but knowing that no amount of fresh air could scrub the coffin from my memory. When I returned home, there was a letter in the mailbox from the bank. At first I thought it was another routine statement, but as I opened it, I froze. It was a notice that a request had been made to review my accounts under a power of attorney. My breath caught in my throat. I had never signed such a document, or so I thought, but as I read the details, I saw my eldest daughter's name listed. A memory surfaced of weeks earlier when she had visited briefly and brought a stack of papers for me to sign, telling me they were related to some insurance forms she was helping me with. I had not looked closely. My eyesight had made the fine print difficult, and I had trusted her. Now a chill crept down my spine. I went to the bank the next morning, clutching the letter, my hands trembling as I waited for the manager. She confirmed in a tone of forced neutrality that my daughter had filed paperwork asserting authority over my finances. She explained that the document was incomplete, that it still required certain verifications, but that the intent was clear. My daughter wanted legal control of my money. I felt as though the coffin had not been a joke at all, but a declaration of strategy, the first step in convincing the world that I was no longer capable of handling my own affairs. The humiliation of the party now appeared in sharper relief. It had been theater, a staged spectacle to show others how ridiculous, how senile, how close to death I supposedly was. Walking out of the bank, I felt the ground tilt beneath me. My mind raced with images of Margaret again, her steady wisdom, her warnings that trust must never be given blindly. I realized that my children had not only mocked me, but were actively working to strip away what little independence remained. My humiliation online was not an accident, but a tool, a narrative they could point to when they insisted I was no longer competent. The thought made my stomach twist. They had reduced me to a clown in a coffin so that when the time came, they could say, "See?" He laughed along. He didn't even understand what was happening. That evening, I opened the old chest in the garage where Margaret had kept her keepsakes, looking for something, anything, that might ground me. Among the faded letters and yellowed photographs, I found a small envelope with my name on it in her handwriting. My heart pounded as I opened it. Inside was a short note written years ago, in which she told me that if ever I felt cornered or betrayed, I must remember the investments she had urged me to keep separate, the bonds and land titles she had tucked away. I had forgotten about them, dismissed them as minor, but suddenly they seemed like lifelines. My children thought they had maneuvered me into a position of helplessness, but Margaret, even in death, had left me a thread of hope. I sat in the garage for a long time with that envelope in my lap, the smell of dust and oil thick around me, and I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and determination. The humiliation of the coffin had burned something into me, a clarity I had lacked before. My children no longer saw me as a man, but as a wallet and a corpse, but I was neither. Not yet. They believed the performance they had staged had broken me. What they did not know, what they could not know, was that it had awakened me instead. The next morning arrived with a strange stillness, as though the world outside had conspired to match the heaviness pressing against my chest. I had barely slept again, haunted not only by the vision of myself lying in that coffin, but also by the discovery at the bank that my daughter was maneuvering to seize control of my life as though I were already incapable of steering it myself. The air felt heavier than usual, the sound of the old clock ticking in the living room sharp as a hammer against my nerves, and I found myself wandering the house like a man both restless and lost, touching the edges of furniture as though to remind myself I was still present, still rooted, still alive. Yet beneath that thin reassurance churned a fear I could not suppress, the knowledge that my humiliation had been a public declaration, a weapon my children had chosen to wield against me. I made the decision that morning to examine the bonds and land documents Margaret had left hidden away, because I needed to know whether the faint thread of hope she had preserved could be transformed into something tangible, something that might protect me from the tightening noose my children were preparing. I sat at the dining room table, spreading the papers across its polished surface, and studied them as best I could with my failing eyes. There were government savings bonds purchased decades earlier, modest in their original amounts, but now matured to values that surprised me, and more significantly, a deed to a small parcel of land on the outskirts of town that I had nearly forgotten, about property Margaret had inherited from her father, and insisted on keeping even when we had considered selling it to help with the children's tuition. I felt a pang as I remembered her quiet insistence that one must always hold something back, not out of mistrust, but out of prudence, and for the first time since her death I felt as though she were sitting beside me again, whispering that she had foreseen the moment when I might need a shield. Later that afternoon, I forced myself to attend a routine appointment with my physician, something my eldest daughter had scheduled weeks earlier. The visit, which I assumed would be ordinary, quickly revealed itself to be another piece in the puzzle of manipulation. The doctor, a man I had seen for years, began asking questions in a different tone, his eyes lingering on me with a mixture of pity and scrutiny, and I realized almost immediately that he had been influenced by the stories my children were spinning. He asked whether I ever became confused, whether I had trouble remembering dates, whether I had experienced moments of disorientation in my own home. My pulse quickened as I understood that these questions were not casual but calculated, a script designed to build a record of incompetence. I answered firmly, resisting the temptation to let weariness dull my words, insisting that I was still capable of managing my life. The doctor made notes in his chart, and though he did not say anything explicit, I could sense the doubt hanging in the air, seated there by the voices of my own children. That night, as I sat at the kitchen table once again with Margaret's envelope beside me, I realized that the coffin had not been the low point, but the beginning of something far more insidious. My children were not merely mocking me. They were orchestrating my erasure, step by step, preparing to strip me of autonomy until I was nothing more than a body they could place wherever it was convenient. The humiliation at the party had been their proof of concept, their way of showing the world that I was laughable, incompetent, a man halfway gone. Now the paperwork at the bank and the subtle influence over my doctor confirmed that their intentions reached deeper. They were preparing to bury me alive, not in the literal coffin, not yet, but in the legal and social coffin of declared incapacity. The realization filled me with a rage so cold it felt almost like clarity. For years I had endured their distance, their condescension, their treatment of me as an inconvenient relic, but I had never believed they would cross into betrayal so deliberate. Yet as I sat there, my fists clenched, the ticking clock pounding, I understood that Margaret had prepared me for this battle. She had left me not only resources, but also the memory of her voice, reminding me that dignity is not surrendered. It is taken only if one consents. I thought of the video online of the strangers who had mocked me, of the so-called friends and neighbors who had laughed at the party, and I realized that to them I was already defeated. But I was not. Not yet. And if my children thought the coffin was the end of my story, they had underestimated how fiercely a man can cling to life when all else has been stripped away. By the time the week turned, the video had settled into the bloodstream of the town like a slow poison, and I could feel its presence even in places where no one spoke of it. In the subtle way a cashier's smile drifted into a smirk. In the way a neighbor I had known for 30 years lifted 2 fingers from his steering wheel and then pretended he hadn't seen me, as if my presence embarrassed him. The humiliation had become atmosphere, and I understood that if I did not change the air in my own house, I would be forced to breathe what my children had manufactured until I gave up. I spent a morning at the dining table with Margaret's envelope and a notepad, drawing slow, careful lines between what I still controlled and what they were trying to seize. And when I finished mapping the terrain of my life, I saw plainly that the next assault would not be another party trick but paperwork, signatures, affidavits, a polite petition with my name at the top and the word incapacitated, humming below like a bass note you feel before you hear. So I called an elder law attorney recommended years ago by a friend who had since passed on, a woman named Ellen Carver, who had the voice of a person who had spent a lifetime translating grief into legal language. And I told her everything, not sparing myself, not trimming the shame, and when I was done she did not tell me to calm down or to be reasonable. She said very simply, "We're going to build a wall, and then we're going to choose who gets a gate." In her office the next day, under the steady buzz of a fluorescent light that made the file folders glow a tired yellow, she outlined the wall with the care of a mason who understands weather. First, she said, we would revoke any power of attorney I might have signed under confusion or pressure and file that revocation where it could not be ignored. Second, we would establish a living trust to hold my primary assets, with a corporate fiduciary as successor rather than a family member, eager to turn keys into crowbars. The trust would not make me immortal, she said gently, but it would make me inconvenient to rob. Third, we would ensure my health care directives named neutral advocates, not children who giggled at coffins, and we would document my competence through independent evaluations that did not rely on a doctor primed by whispers. I listened, my hands folded to hide their tremor, and nodded, and when she slid the papers across to me, I read as if each line was a plank I would have to stand on in a storm. The notary arrived with the quiet solemnity of a chaplain, and I signed with a pen that felt heavier than it ought to. When it was done, Ellen placed the stack in a banker's box as if tucking a child into bed, then looked at me and said that some people mistake love for entitlement until a boundary teaches them the difference. On the way home, I stopped by the bank to open the trust account and to move the matured bonds Margaret had left into their new shelter, and while the clerk typed with the gentle speed of one who fears mistakes, a message arrived on my phone from a number I did not recognize, a handful of words that made the room tilt. Grandpa, I'm sorry. They're going to file for emergency guardianship tomorrow. Please be careful. The name on the message was my grandson Ethan, a boy I had taught to skip stones and whose voice I had not heard in years, except through a cracked speaker on birthdays when his mother prodded him to perform. He followed the text with screenshots from the family group chat, a stream of messages that turned my stomach cold, links to the Coffin video with captions like, "This makes our case," instructions to collect anecdotes of my supposed confusion, reminders to the others to emphasize the risk of financial exploitation, as if I were the predator of my own savings. I thanked him and asked why he was sending this to me, and after a pause he wrote that he had watched the party with a pit growing in his chest and could not bear the idea of a court treating me like a child, that his mother and uncle would probably call him a traitor, and maybe he was, but that he remembered the way I had lifted him onto my shoulders to see the fireworks when he was small, and he did not want the next fireworks to be my life exploding quietly on a judge's calendar. I forwarded the messages to Ellen with a heart that hammered like a carpenter's fist, and she replied almost immediately to say that we would arrive at the courthouse before any emergency petition could be heard, that we would file our revocations, and trust instruments and letters from 2 independent physicians who would see me at once that afternoon, and that we would ask the court for an order prohibiting further interference pending a full hearing. I spent the remainder of the day being measured and questioned by professionals who seemed to be looking for signs of wear, but found only the ordinary erosion of time, and when each of them signed a letter stating that my memory and judgment remained intact, I felt as though Margaret had reached across the years to tip the scales back toward fairness. The next morning, in a hallway that smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee, we stood before a judge who listened without interrupting as Ellen explained the circumstances, her voice steady and unadorned, offering documents the way a nurse offers. Medicine without drama, but with urgency. When my children arrived late and breathless, they wore expressions of wounded outrage that would have convinced anyone who had not seen the screenshots or stood in the coffin, and their attorney raised the coffin video on a tablet as proof of my decline until Ellen, with surgical calm, asked whether the court should take judicial notice of viral humiliation as a medical diagnosis. The judge frowned. The attorney lowered the tablet. My son's jaw tightened, and I felt a flicker of shame rise to meet my anger, not because I was at fault, but because my children had finally dragged our private decay into a room where strangers would garnish it with procedure. The emergency petition was denied, not with fanfare, not with the righteousness I craved, but with the simple reason that the law requires more than gossip to remove a man's life from his hands, and the judge admonished us to seek a family solution, even as he signed the order barring interference, which struck me as telling a man to make peace with the arsonist while also turning on the sprinklers. In the parking lot, my eldest daughter approached with eyes already moist, the kind of tears that look like confession but taste like strategy, and she asked to speak to me alone, which Ellen permitted only within earshot. My daughter said she was afraid for me, that I had never been good with details and that I was too trusting, that strangers would trick me, and that she was only trying to protect me the way Mother would have wanted. And I heard in her words the familiar symphony of justification, the melody of care covering the drumbeat of control. I told her quietly that the person who humiliated me on my birthday did not earn the right to manage my dignity, and that protection begins with respect. And for a moment, something in her eyes flickered, perhaps a memory of the father who once carried her sleeping from the car to her bed, but the flicker died when my son stalked over and accused me of letting outsiders poison my mind, by which he meant lawyers, doctors, and the grandson whose conscience had finally pried open a window. If escalation were only courtrooms and papers, I might have rested that night with a kind of exhausted relief. But malice adapts, and the next blow came wrapped in concern. 2 days later, a pair of officers knocked on my door to perform a wellness check prompted by an anonymous tip about a confused elderly man living amid hazards. And though the officers were courteous and even apologetic, I felt the cold draft of suspicion when they stepped into my living room and glanced at the unplugged lamp I'd been meaning to fix, at the shelf where Margaret's porcelain figures stood in precise little rows, at the pill organizer sitting open on the table. I showed them that the pills were in order, that the food in the refrigerator was fresh, that the smoke detectors worked, and after a few questions they thanked me and left. But the house felt invaded, as if the air still held the shape of their uniforms. I called Ellen, who sighed in a way that told me she had seen this play too many times, and she advised me to install a camera on my porch and to keep a simple log of unexpected visits, not because we needed drama, but because a record is a mirror that does not blink. The children did not stop with the police. They pivoted back to the doctor who had hesitated during my last visit. Pressing him for a cognitive screening he was finally honest enough to admit I did not need, and when he declined to label me for their convenience, they switched to a new practitioner who marketed himself as a specialist in aging and who, according to a nurse Ethan put me in touch with, had a reputation for finding deficits wherever families asked him to look. I refused to attend the appointment, a refusal that was then presented as evidence of paranoia, which he learned in the same breath that they had attempted to access a safe deposit box at a bank where my name no longer appeared, thanks to the trust Thwarted there, they contacted a funeral home to start a conversation about pre-need arrangements, a phrase that settled into my stomach like a stone. When a representative from that funeral home called to offer support during this difficult transition, I felt the room spin, and I answered with a politeness so cold it almost cracked, telling him that my transition would be scheduled on my terms, and that the next time he wished to speak about my body, he should do so only after I was finished using it. But escalation is not measured only in strikes against the victim. There is also the counterpressure of a man gathering his strength, and in those days I found that each humiliation made my movements less hesitant. I visited the county recorder to confirm the deed to the small parcel of land Margaret had preserved, and learned that a developer had long coveted the acreage for a distribution center, offering a price that would once have been unthinkable for a patch of scrub in memory. I did not sell that day. Instead, I signed a letter of intent that put my name back into the ledger as a person who could make a market move, and when I walked out into the sun with the letter folded in my pocket, I felt taller by a fraction, as if my spine had learned a dialect of defiance. I met with a financial officer at the trust company who explained how predictable monthly distributions could free me from the small frictions my children called evidence of decline. And I thought, as she spoke, how strange it was that the dignity my family refused to grant me could be so effortlessly provided by strangers following rules. Late one evening, while the house hummed with its old appliances and the street outside darkened into the kind of quiet Margaret used to call a good hush, Ethan came by without warning, standing on my porch with his hands stuffed into his jacket, looking both older and younger than I remembered, as if the apology he carried had shaved years from his face and added others to his eyes. He said he couldn't stay long, that his mother would say he was being manipulated, but he needed to return something that was not his to keep, and he handed me a small leather notebook I recognized at once, the book Margaret had used during our last year together to jot down grocery lists and prayer requests, and in a few neat pages, a series of notes about the land and bonds she had insisted we shelter. He had found it, he said, in a box his mother had taken from my garage after the funeral, a box she claimed held only holiday decorations. And he had kept the notebook because he liked the feel of it, not realizing until he read the first page that it belonged to a history deeper than his own. He apologized again, said he was ashamed of what the family had done, and when I told him that shame is useful only if it changes a person's direction, he nodded, as if memorizing an address. We stood there in the cool air, two men from different ends of the same rope, and I realized that the cruelty of my children had not entirely poisoned the well, that there remained in our bloodline at least one person who could recognize a human being when he saw one. The next morning my son arrived unannounced with a real estate agent and a smile he borrowed from a wolf, announcing loudly from the porch that he was here to help me downsize, which he pronounced as if the word meant mercy rather than exile. I opened the door but did not invite them in, and when he tried to push past me I stood firm and let the hinge press against his ambition. He said I was being unreasonable, that a smaller place would be safer, that he and his sister had already toured a facility with nice gardens and a calendar of activities, and that if I signed today we could secure a discount. I told him there are discounts only for those eager to leave, that my house may be quieter than his sense of urgency prefers, but it fits my bones. And when he muttered that the facility had a room set aside for grief counseling, I said my grief was not a hobby to be scheduled between bingo and chair yoga. The agent, to her credit, took a step back as if a draft had reached her, and when my son finally realized he would not be selling me like a couch, he hissed that I would regret being stubborn. Perhaps, I said, but regret is better company than contempt. After he left, I sat in the chair Margaret always claimed as hers and let the house settle around me, the old wood speaking in clicks and sighs, and I understood that the war had entered its second, harsher phase, the one where the enemy, denied a quick victory, resorts to siege. They would circle, they would probe, they would call agencies and strangers and spin every refusal into a symptom. They would try to turn my world into a narrow corridor lined with clipboards and folded brochures. But I also understood that I was no longer merely enduring, I was shaping. The trust existed, the revocations were filed, the physicians had written their letters, The judge had drawn a temporary line, the land had a price, the grandson had found his courage, and the woman I loved had, through an old notebook and a few hard-won precautions, reached forward to place in my palm something I could still use, the right to choose my next move. I looked at the phone, which had become in recent weeks a bell that tolled for humiliation, and I decided that the next time it rang it would be because I had set the time. The day that everything finally snapped into place came not with thunder, but with the ordinary sound of the mail slot clicking, as though fate preferred subtlety when it delivered turning points. Among the bills and the glossy advertisements lay a letter from the courthouse, notifying me of the date my children had finally secured for a full guardianship hearing, the one they had been circling toward with every wellness check, every manipulative whisper to doctors, every humiliating stunt designed to make me appear weak. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, and reading the dry, bureaucratic language, I felt a coldness that was not fear, but something harder, a kind of metallic certainty that this was the battlefield Margaret had prepared me to walk across. I folded the letter carefully and placed it on the kitchen table beside her notebook and the trust documents, and for a long time I sat in silence, listening to the refrigerator hum and the faint ticking of the wall clock, until the air itself seemed to lean in, waiting for me to decide whether I would step forward or collapse. When the day came, I dressed not in the jacket I had worn to the party where they laughed at me, but in the suit I had kept wrapped in plastic since Margaret's funeral, pressing it the night before with meticulous care, as though every crease was a line of defense. I polished the cufflinks she had given me, fastening them with hands that no longer trembled because they knew they were not shaking for themselves, but for the honor of something larger. At the courthouse the hallways smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant, and I saw my children gathered near the entrance with their attorney, their voices lowered, but their eyes flashing with the self-assurance of people who believe victory is inevitable. They looked at me, not with love, but with the kind of tight smiles gamblers wear before laying down what they think is a winning hand, and for the first time I did not flinch. Inside the courtroom the proceedings began with the slow, procedural rhythm that masks the gravity of what is actually happening, but when their attorney rose and began to describe me as a man slipping into decline, as someone vulnerable to exploitation, as a father whose judgment was fatally compromised, the words did not land as intended. They echoed against the walls but met resistance because Ellen, calm and deliberate, stood and presented the trust documents, the revocation of power of attorney, the physician's letters, the log of harassment, and finally the screenshots Ethan had provided. She spoke not with fury but with precision, as if every syllable were a nail securing the scaffolding of truth, and when she was done, she turned to me and asked if I wished to speak. I rose slowly, the weight of the room pressing down on my shoulders, but once I found my balance I looked not at the judge, but at my children. I told them that I remembered the nights sitting beside their beds when they were small, holding their hands through fevers, whispering promises that I would always protect them, and I asked them if they remembered that the word protection once meant safety and not control. I reminded them that respect is not a gift given to the young by the old, but a covenant that runs in both directions, and I said clearly, so that every person in that room would hear, that a coffin is not a toy, that a father is not a joke, and that any family that forgets these truths will eventually bury not a man, but its own soul. The courtroom was silent except for the scratching of the stenographer's keys, and when I finally turned to the judge, I said that I was not asking for indulgence or for sentiment, but simply for the right to finish my life standing upright rather than lying down under the weight of ridicule. The judge leaned back, studying me, and in that moment the silence was heavier than any laughter I had endured. Then he spoke, slowly, affirming that competence is measured not in years but in clarity, and that the evidence before him left no doubt that I remained capable of managing my affairs. He dismissed the petition with prejudice, a phrase I had never fully understood until I saw the faces of my children collapse into disbelief, and he warned them in measured tones that the court would not tolerate further attempts to erode my autonomy under the guise of concern. The gavel struck once, and the sound reverberated through my bones like a drum beat of finality. As we left the courtroom, my children avoided my eyes, speaking in hushed tones to one another, their anger now mingled with something sharper, shame. Ethan walked beside me, not touching my arm, but close enough that I felt steadied by his presence, and Ellen nodded Bardon once with a faint smile that carried no triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of justice briefly prevailing. Outside, the sun was brighter than it had been in weeks, and I stood on the courthouse steps breathing deeply, the air crisp and alive, knowing that the coffin they had placed me in had become not a grave but a crucible, and that I had emerged not diminished but sharpened. In the days after the courtroom, the house no longer felt like a prison of silence, but something closer to a sanctuary, though not because the walls themselves had changed, but because I walked among them with the knowledge that I had defended my place within them. For the first time in years, I brewed my morning coffee without the bitter taste of resignation clinging to it, and I found myself speaking aloud to Margaret again, not with the desperation of a man pleading into emptiness, but with the calm of someone reporting back to a trusted partner. I told her that our children had tried to put me underground before the ground was ready, that they had mistaken their hunger for inheritance as care, and that though the wound of betrayal would never fully heal, I had managed to hold the line. I told her about Ethan, about how he had found the courage to choose decency over conspiracy, and I thanked her for insisting all those years ago that we protect something of our own, a shield waiting in the shadows until it was needed. The neighbors no longer laughed when I passed them on the sidewalk, perhaps because they had seen the collapse of my children's petition reported in the local paper, perhaps because shame, once exposed, moves quickly through small towns. Some offered awkward greetings, some pretended the Coffin incident had been nothing more than a tasteless joke gone too far, but I did not waste energy correcting them. I had learned that dignity does not always require vindication. Sometimes it only requires endurance. When the grocer asked whether I was feeling better, I smiled faintly and said that I was, leaving him to puzzle over the truth of that answer. In a way, I was better. Better not because the betrayal hurt less, but because I finally carried it openly, no longer denying that the children I had raised were capable of reducing me to an object. Once you look directly at the wound, you stop flinching every time someone brushes near it. Ethan began visiting more often, not every day, but enough that the silence of the house no longer pressed as heavily. We would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the light fade, and he would ask about Margaret, about the years when his mother and uncle were small, and I would tell him stories that carried laughter and sorrow in equal measure. Sometimes he would apologize again, as though the guilt of his family's cruelty still clung to him, and I would remind him that remorse is only useful if it steers you toward better choices, and that he had already chosen differently. I saw in his eyes the possibility that not everything had been lost, that though the bond with my own children might be beyond repair, the chain did not have to break entirely. In him there remained a thread of continuity, a reminder that legacy is not only measured in money or property, but in whether someone remembers you as more than a punchline. As for my other children, their calls grew fewer, their voices colder, and eventually silence replaced even the pretense of contact. I accepted that absence not with relief, but with a grim acknowledgement that sometimes family ceases to function as family, and what remains is only blood without loyalty. They had shown me their truest faces when they lowered me into that coffin, and though the court had stopped their hands from taking my life apart on paper, nothing could erase the truth of what they had revealed about their hearts. I did not hate them because hatred requires energy I no longer wish to spend, but I also did not forgive because forgiveness requires repentance, and none had been offered. I let them drift, and the distance became its own form of peace. On the evening of my 77th birthday, I drove alone to the cemetery where Margaret rested, carrying with me the bottle of wine we had saved for our 50th anniversary, but never opened. I sat beside her headstone as the last of the daylight bled out of the sky, pouring a glass and raising it in her direction. I told her that the children had betrayed us, that they had mistaken cruelty for wit and greed for care, but that I had remembered her words, her insistence that we prepare, and that in the end her foresight had carried me through. I drank slowly, letting the wine burn against my tongue, and I felt the kind of bittersweet warmth that comes not from triumph, but from survival. I whispered to her that though they had tried to bury me early, I had walked away from the coffin, and that I was still here, stubborn and standing, and that was victory enough. When I finally rose to leave, I did not feel young and I did not feel whole, but I felt steady, and that was more than I had expected to feel again. I understood that the story of my life would not be written by the laughter of that cruel night, nor by the signatures my children had tried to force onto paper, but by the quiet persistence of continuing each day in spite of them. They had wanted me reduced, erased, folded into silence, but instead I had become sharper, a man who knew the weight of betrayal and still refused to bow beneath it. And as I walked back to the car, the night settling around me, I thought that perhaps the greatest act of defiance left to me was not anger, not revenge, not even the legal victories we had secured, but the simple fact of breathing, of carrying. Margaret's memory forward of living in a house that still held my laughter, even if it echoed alone,